It was raining the day we buried my wife, Margaret. The kind of cold, relentless rain that seeps into your bones and makes everything feel heavier than it already is. I stood by her grave in silence, gripping the umbrella with one hand and the folded handkerchief she'd once embroidered my initials on with the other. The world felt empty, muted, until my son, David, stepped beside me and shattered what little peace remained. "Dad," he said, voice steady but eyes sharp. "We need to talk about the inheritance." The words hit harder than the rain. I turned slowly, thinking I'd misheard him, but he wasn't looking at the grave. He was looking at me. "My inheritance," he repeated. "Mom would have wanted me to have my share. I know she left things in your control, but let's not make this difficult." For a long moment, I couldn't find my voice. My wife's coffin hadn't even touched the earth yet, and my son was already thinking about the money. $65 million, the result of 40 years of work, sacrifice, and sleepless nights. I stared at him, the same boy I once taught to ride a bike, the one whose scraped knees I used to bandage. "David," I said quietly, "we're at your mother's funeral." He shrugged, unbothered. "That's exactly why we should talk now. She's gone. There's no reason to delay what's mine." I felt something inside me break. Not anger at first, but disbelief. The priest's final words echoed behind us, blurred by the sound of shovels and thunder. David didn't flinch. That night, when I got home, I poured myself a drink and sat by the fireplace. Margaret's photo sat on the mantel, her smile frozen in time. I whispered to it, "You always said money changes people." You were right. Over the next few days, things only got worse. David sent emails, then lawyers. He accused me of withholding what he claimed was rightfully his. My own son, my only child, had turned my grief into a negotiation. But grief has a way of sharpening you. And while he was busy counting money that wasn't his yet, I was quietly planning something else. Margaret and I had built our wealth together, investments, real estate, companies across states. She always wanted that money to build something lasting, something meaningful. "Not for greed," she'd said once, "but for good." So I went to my lawyer, the same man who had handled our estate for decades. I told him to rewrite the will. David's name stayed on it, but with a condition. He would only receive the inheritance if he worked for it, managing a new foundation in his mother's name for 5 years. No salary, no shortcuts, full accountability. If he refused, everything would go to charity. When David found out, he exploded. He came to my house, yelling, fists clenched, face red. "You can't do this, Dad. You're manipulating me." I stood firm. "I'm giving you a chance," I said calmly, "to prove you deserve it." He sneered. "You're just punishing me because I said what everyone's thinking. You're too old to control all that money." I looked at him, my son, a stranger now. "Maybe I am old," I said, "but I'm not blind." He left that night, slamming the door behind him. Weeks passed. I didn't hear a word. Then one morning, I opened the paper and saw his name in the business section. He tried to start a company with borrowed money, and it had collapsed, taking dozens of investors down with it. I didn't feel satisfaction, just sorrow. A month later, I received a call. It was David. His voice cracked as he spoke. "Dad, I lost everything. I need help." I was silent for a moment. "You already had it," I said quietly. "You just didn't want it in the form it was given." He begged. He cried. And for the first time in years, I heard something in his tone I hadn't heard since he was a child: humility. I told him to come home. When he arrived, he looked smaller somehow. The arrogance had been stripped away, replaced by something raw and real. He apologized, not for the money, but for everything, for the distance, the greed, the coldness that had grown between us. I told him I'd give him one last chance. He'd take the foundation job, not because of the money, but because of his mother. And to my surprise, he agreed. The first few months were rocky. Missed deadlines, careless mistakes. But slowly, something shifted. He started listening, learning, and caring. He began visiting orphanages, hospitals, community centers, the very places his mother had dreamed of helping. One evening, he came home, eyes tired but soft. "I met this little girl today," he said. "She lost her mom last year. I told her about Mom, about how she helped people she never even met." He paused. "I think I finally understand what she meant." I said nothing, just smiled. Because for the first time in years, I saw Margaret's reflection in his face. 5 years passed. David completed his term. He never once asked about the inheritance again. When the time came, I transferred everything to him, all 65 million. He looked at the papers, then at me. "Dad," he said quietly, "I don't want it." I chuckled. "You earned it, son." He shook his head. "No, I think Mom's foundation could use it more." And that's exactly what he did. Today, that foundation feeds thousands, educates children, builds homes, and carries Margaret's name across places she never got to see. David runs it with his wife, and every year, on the anniversary of her passing, we visit her grave together. No arguments, no talk of money. Just flowers, silence, and peace. The world took my wife. Grief nearly took my son. But love, patient, quiet love, brought him back. And as I stand there watching the rain fall again, I realize something. Sometimes revenge doesn't come in fury or destruction. Sometimes the sweetest revenge is simply teaching someone the lesson they were too blind to see, and watching them finally learn it. Years later, the world had moved on, as it always does. But for me, time had slowed down, ripened like old wine. The house that once echoed with arguments and silence now hummed with laughter and life. David would visit often, bringing his wife and their 2 children, my grandchildren, who filled every corner of the home with chaos and joy. It was strange watching him now. The same man who once demanded his inheritance at his mother's funeral now sat on the floor helping his daughter color handmade cards for the foundation's donors. He had grown into the man Margaret always believed he could be. One afternoon, as the sun spilled gold through the living room windows, David joined me on the porch with 2 cups of coffee. He handed one to me, his expression thoughtful. "You know, Dad," he said quietly, "for a long time I hated you." I didn't flinch. "I know," I said. "I hated what you'd become too." He nodded slowly, then smiled. "But now I get it. You weren't trying to take something from me. You were trying to give me something I didn't even know I needed." I looked at him for a long moment. "Perspective," I said. He chuckled softly. "And purpose." We sat in silence for a while, the kind of silence that doesn't hurt anymore, the kind that feels earned. He sipped his coffee, eyes on the distant hills. "Do you ever miss Mom?" he asked suddenly. "Every day," I said. "But I think she's been here all along." He nodded, his gaze dropping to his wedding ring. "I think she'd be proud of the foundation, of everything." "She'd be proud of you," I said. "Not because of what you've built, but because of who you became." A breeze stirred, carrying the faint scent of lilacs, Margaret's favorite flower. For a moment, it felt like she was there with us, smiling at what we'd finally managed to become. A family healed by time, loss, and love. As the years rolled on, the foundation grew. It built schools, hospitals, shelters, all under the banner of the Margaret Hale Foundation. Every year, David stood on that stage, speaking with quiet conviction about second chances, humility, and redemption. And every time, I'd sit in the front row, hands clasped, heart full. But life, as it always does, began to slow me down. My hands trembled more, my steps grew uncertain, and my voice began to fade. One morning, David came to visit, finding me in my chair by the fireplace, a familiar spot I'd occupied for decades. He knelt beside me, his eyes soft but lined with worry. "You okay, Dad?" I smiled faintly. "I'm fine, son. Just tired." He took my hand, his grip firm. "You've done enough. You gave everything." I shook my head weakly. "No, David. We did." He swallowed hard, tears glinting in his eyes. "You saved me, Dad. You really did." I chuckled softly. "You saved yourself. I just made sure you didn't forget where you came from." That night, he stayed with me until I fell asleep. I remember the warmth of the fire, the sound of the rain outside, just like that day so long ago. But this time, the rain didn't feel heavy. Felt clean, new, forgiving. When I woke the next morning, the light was different, soft, endless. And though I couldn't see them anymore, I knew Margaret and David were still there, carrying on everything we'd built, everything we'd learned. Because what started as greed had become purpose. What began in loss had ended in love. And when the story of our family is told, maybe whispered years from now by some stranger in another time, they won't remember the fortune or the fights or even the revenge. They'll remember the lesson, that true wealth isn't what you leave behind, it's who you leave better, and that, in the end, was worth more than $65 million ever could be. Years after I was gone, the foundation continued to grow, larger and stronger than even I could have imagined. David poured his soul into it, not as a way to honor me or atone for his past, but because it had become his purpose. It wasn't just a job anymore, it was his legacy. And through that legacy, mine and Margaret's hearts kept beating in every school built, every hospital wing opened, every child given a chance at a better life. I'd left behind letters for him, sealed envelopes marked for certain milestones in his life. One for when his first child was born, one for his 10th wedding anniversary, and one for the day he'd opened the 100th branch of the Margaret Hale Foundation. That day came 23 years later. David stood on a massive stage before a sea of faces, donors, volunteers, families, and children whose lives had been changed. Behind him, on a towering screen, was the foundation's emblem, a single white lily blooming through cracked stone, Margaret's favorite flower, her symbol of resilience. He spoke with the same calm conviction that had once belonged to me. This foundation was born from pain, he said, his voice carrying through the crowd. From loss, from regret, from a man who refused to let greed define the end of our story. My father believed that money only matters when it builds something that outlives you. Today, I finally understand what he meant. As the applause roared, he reached into his jacket and pulled out a weathered envelope, the one I'd left him. He opened it slowly, the room falling silent. Inside was a single sheet of paper yellowed with time. My handwriting, shaky but deliberate, filled the page. Son, if you're reading this, it means you've done what your mother and I always hoped. You've built something beautiful out of what was broken. You turned your anger into purpose, your greed into giving. That is what true redemption looks like. The money was never the legacy, David. You are. His hands trembled as he read it aloud, his voice cracking toward the end. He was right, he said softly. He always was. The audience stood, clapping not just for the foundation, but for the man who had transformed his father's lesson into a life's mission. After the ceremony, David walked to the garden behind the main building, a quiet space filled with lilies and a small marble bench engraved with two names, Margaret and Henry Hale. Beneath it, the words I'd written years ago were carved into stone. Love is the only inheritance worth keeping. He sat there for a long while, the same way I used to sit by that old fireplace, listening to the rain. His daughter, Emily, now grown, joined him and rested her head on his shoulder. Grandpa would be proud, she said quietly. David smiled faintly, eyes glistening. He already is. I can feel it. The two of them sat in silence as the sun dipped behind the horizon, casting a warm orange glow over the lilies. For a brief moment, the wind shifted, carrying with it the faint scent of rain. And for David, that scent meant home. He looked up at the sky and whispered, "Thank you, Dad, for everything." And somewhere, beyond the reach of time and rain, I smiled. Because the story that began in bitterness and betrayal didn't end in revenge. It ended in grace. And if there's anything worth leaving behind in this world, it's not wealth or property or power. It's the strength to rise after falling, the courage to forgive, and the wisdom to love again, even when it hurts. That was my final lesson to my son, and it became the story of his life. In the end, that was all I ever wanted, not to be remembered for the money I made, but for the man I raised. Years later, long after David had gone gray himself, the foundation had become something beyond what any of us could have dreamed. It wasn't just a charity anymore, it was a movement, a living legacy. It reached across continents, lifting people out of poverty, funding education, disaster relief, and healthcare. The world knew the Margaret Hale Foundation as a symbol of hope. But those who knew its story really understood it was born not from fortune, but from forgiveness. David rarely spoke of me publicly after that last speech. He said the story was ours, private, sacred. But in quiet moments, he still carried it with him. Every year, on the anniversary of the foundation's founding, he'd visit the same bench in the garden. Always at dawn, when the air was cool and the lilies were still heavy with dew. One morning, his daughter, Emily, now a grown woman and the foundation's new director, followed him quietly. She found him sitting there, eyes closed, hands folded, lips moving in silent prayer. When he opened his eyes, he saw her and smiled. "You're up early," he said. "I figured it was time I learned why you come here every year," she replied. He gestured to the bench beside him and she sat. The morning light stretched across the marble, catching on the engraved words. "Love is the only inheritance worth keeping." "Your grandfather used to sit like this," David said, "every morning after Mom died. Quiet, patient, like he was listening for something only he could hear." Emily leaned her head against his shoulder. "Do you ever miss him?" "Every day," he said softly. "But he never really left. Everything I am, everything this foundation stands for, came from him and Mom." She smiled faintly. "You know, people think this place was built with money, but I think it was built with second chances." David chuckled. That's exactly what he'd say. For a while, they sat in silence, watching the sun climb higher. Birds fluttered across the garden, landing among the lilies. It was peaceful, the kind of peace that only comes after years of storms. After a moment, Emily spoke again. "Dad, I've been thinking, we should open a new wing in his name. Grandpa's name. He deserves to be remembered too." David looked down at the plaque, running his fingers gently over the engraved letters. "He already is," he whispered. But later that year, when the foundation celebrated its 50th anniversary, Emily made good on her promise. A new building rose, the Henry Hale Center for Family Renewal. Its mission, to help parents and children rebuild after loss, conflict, or estrangement. At the grand opening, she stood before a crowd, much like her father once had, and told our story, not of wealth or tragedy, but of love reborn from pain. "My grandfather didn't just leave us money," she said. "He left us a map, a way to find our way back to each other, no matter how lost we became. That's what this place stands for." As the audience applauded, David stood in the front row, hands clasped, tears glistening. He had lived a long life, full of mistakes, lessons, and grace. And now, watching his daughter carry the torch, he knew it had all been worth it. When the ceremony ended, he returned once more to the garden. The lilies swayed gently in the breeze. He sat down, closed his eyes, and said softly, "We did it, Dad. We really did it." And in that quiet moment, the wind rose, rustling the trees, carrying the faintest scent of rain, that familiar, comforting smell that had followed our story from the beginning. He smiled, because love, real love, doesn't die with us, continues passed from hand to hand, heart to heart, generation to generation. And though my voice had faded long ago, its echo lived on in them, in every act of kindness, every rebuilt life, every forgiven heart. That was the final revenge against bitterness, against greed, against death itself. Not money, not power, but legacy, built on love, carried by family, and immortalized in purpose. And so, the story didn't end when I left this world. It simply changed hands, from father to son, from son to daughter, from one heart to the next, forever. As the years drifted on, the Henry Hale Center grew into something vast. Not just a building, but a sanctuary for people trying to stitch their broken lives back together. Families came through its doors carrying grief, betrayal, and loss, and left with hope in their hands. David lived to see it all. Every brick, every name on every donor plaque, Every letter from someone who'd found forgiveness because of what we started. He never remarried after Margaret. Said she was the only one who truly understood his heart and mine. When he turned 70, Emily surprised him with a gala. Not a celebration of wealth, but of legacy. Hundreds gathered in a candlelit hall, faces glimmering in soft gold. Pictures lined the walls, images of families reunited, children smiling, volunteers planting gardens where there had once been ruins. Emily took the stage and raised her glass. "To my father," she said, voice steady but trembling with pride, "and to the man whose love made all of this possible, my grandfather, Henry Hale. They taught us that forgiveness isn't weakness, and that family, even when fractured, can be mended if we're willing to fight for it." The room erupted in applause, but David didn't stand. He sat quietly, looking toward the corner of the room where my old portrait hung. It wasn't a grand portrait, just a simple one, me smiling faintly, Margaret's hand on my shoulder. He whispered, "We did it, Dad. One last time." A few months later, on a still morning much like the one he'd shared with Emily years before, David passed away in his sleep, peaceful, content, and free of the bitterness that once consumed him. When Emily found him, he was sitting in his chair by the garden window, a small folded note resting on his lap. She opened it and read, "To my dearest Emily, if you're reading this, I'm finally with Grandma and Grandpa again. You were the light that carried our family through its darkest days. Don't let the world harden your heart. Forgive quickly, love deeply, and remember, the true inheritance is never money, but the strength to rise above. Love always, Dad." Tears streamed down her face as she folded the letter back. Outside, the garden shimmered under the morning sun. The lilies, Margaret's lilies, bloomed brighter than ever. That day, she planted a new one beside them, white with golden edges, and named it the Legacy Lily. It became the foundation's emblem, a reminder that even from grief and greed, beauty can bloom again. And so, the Margaret Hale Foundation and Henry Hale Center stood together, symbols of what forgiveness could build, a monument not to revenge, but to redemption. In the end, I suppose that's the truest kind of revenge there is, not destroying those who wronged you, but proving that love, when tested, can become eternal. Because greed dies with the greedy, but legacy outlives us all. Years turned into decades, and Emily's children grew up running through the same gardens their grandfather and great-grandfather once tended. The legacy lily spread across the grounds, its petals glowing faintly at sunrise, as if the earth itself remembered every tear, every fight, every quiet act of forgiveness that had brought it here. Visitors from all over the world came to see the center, not just for what it did, but for what it stood for. The story of the Hale family had become something of a legend, whispered among those who sought healing. People spoke of the father who turned grief into generosity, the son who turned anger into compassion, and the granddaughter who carried their vision into the future. Emily often told the story to her children, the same way David once told it to her. They'd sit on the old garden bench under the willow tree, where my plaque still rested. She'd say, "Your great-grandfather Henry taught us something most people forget, that money can build walls or bridges. It depends on the hands that hold it." Her son, little James, would always ask, "Did Grandpa Henry ever get mad? Like really mad?" She'd laugh softly. "Oh, he did. But he learned that real strength isn't in how hard you fight. It's in how deeply you forgive." One day, when Emily herself grew old, she stood before a crowd at the 100th anniversary of the Margaret Hale Foundation. Her hair was silver now, but her voice still carried the same warmth her father once had. Behind her, the garden shimmered, thousands of lilies blooming in unison, a sea of white and gold. She began, "A century ago, this place began as a story of pain and pride. A father, a son, and a family torn apart by grief and greed. But what you see here today isn't a story of revenge. It's a story of transformation, how loss became love, and how love became legacy." She paused, looking toward the engraved wall listing the foundation's founders: Henry Hale, Margaret Hale, David Hale, Emily Hale. "We are all, in the end, just links in a chain. she said. But if we forge our link with forgiveness, the chain never breaks. It carries on through every generation. As the audience stood in silence, a soft wind swept through the courtyard. The lilies swayed gently, as if bowing in acknowledgement. That night, Emily walked alone through the garden one last time. She stopped by the bench, brushed her fingers over my name, and smiled. "You were right, Grandpa," she whispered. "Love was the only inheritance worth keeping." And in that moment, as the moonlight spilled across the lilies, she swore she could hear laughter. Faint, familiar, and kind. Mine, Margaret's, David's. The family that once broke under the weight of greed had found eternal peace in grace. The Hale legacy wasn't built on wealth. It was built on love. And love, once planted, never dies. It only grows, quietly, beautifully, into forever. As time went on, the world around the Margaret Hale Foundation changed. Cities grew taller, technology reshaped lives, and generations came and went. Yet, amid all that progress, one thing remained untouched: the garden. Every morning, when the first rays of light cut through the mist, the legacy lilies would bloom, glowing like small lanterns of memory, whispering stories from the past to anyone who cared to listen. Volunteers said they could feel peace there, a serenity that words couldn't capture. Some swore they felt watched over, as if unseen hands still guided the place. By the Foundation's 125th anniversary, Emily's grandchildren had taken the reins. The world knew them as innovators, philanthropists, and visionaries. But to them, the Hale name wasn't about prestige, it was about purpose. They'd grown up hearing the same stories, learning that every choice carried weight, and every act of kindness left a mark that time couldn't erase. One of them, Anna Hale, a young documentary filmmaker, decided to share her family's history with the world. She called it The Lily's Promise. It wasn't a glossy piece about wealth or philanthropy. It was raw, emotional, tracing every chapter of the Hale family's journey, from betrayal and greed to forgiveness and redemption. When the film premiered, it spread like wildfire. Millions watched, many moved to tears. People who'd been estranged from loved ones picked up the phone. Letters poured into the foundation, confessions, thank yous, and stories from people who had found courage in the Hale's tale. Anna never expected fame, but she found something far greater: connection. During an interview, a journalist asked her, "Your family's story has touched millions. What do you think your great-great-grandfather would say if he saw what it's become?" She smiled, glancing toward the garden that shimmered on the screen behind her. "He'd probably say the same thing he always did, that forgiveness is the quietest form of revenge." After the documentary's success, Anna visited the garden alone one evening. She carried a small silver pendant, a locket passed down from her grandmother, Emily. Inside it were two faded photos, one of Henry and Margaret on their wedding day, and one of David holding baby Emily in his arms. Kneeling by the bench, she placed the locket beneath the lilies and whispered, "You've all done your part. It's my turn now." A soft breeze swept through the garden, carrying the scent of rain. The petals trembled lightly, catching the moonlight, and for a moment, it felt as though time itself paused, the generations folding together, the past and present merging in one quiet heartbeat. Years later, when Anna's own daughter took over the foundation, she found that same locket resting beneath the lilies. Inside was a note, written in careful handwriting: "Legacy isn't about what you leave behind. It's about who you lift while you're here." She smiled, tucking it close to her chest, and looked up at the stars. Somewhere beyond them, she felt them all: Henry, Margaret, David, Emily, Anna, still watching, still guiding, still whispering the same truth through time. That love, once planted, outlasts anger. That forgiveness outlives revenge. And that the truest inheritance isn't gold, or land, or fortune, but the peace of knowing you turned pain into purpose. And as the legacy lilies swayed in the night wind, the Hale family's story, born from betrayal, built on forgiveness, bloomed again. Because even when the people fade, the love they leave behind never does. As the centuries turned, the Margaret Hale Foundation became more than just a name in history. It became a living legacy etched into the heart of the world. What began as one man's quiet act of redemption had grown into a global movement. Schools, hospitals, community centers, and shelters now bore the Hale emblem, a simple golden lily, symbolizing rebirth through compassion. The story of the Hales had become legend, taught in universities as a parable of transformation. Historians often debated how much of it was embellished, how much was real. But those who visited the original garden, where it had all begun, didn't need proof. They felt it. The air there was different, sacred almost. The old willow still stood, its branches bowing gracefully over the pond. The bench remained, weathered but strong, engraved with the same words. Love is the only inheritance worth keeping. And beneath it, the lilies never stopped blooming. Every year, descendants of the Hale family, now scattered across continents, gathered there to honor the legacy. Some were scientists, others teachers, doctors, artists, dreamers. Each one carried a piece of that story within them, a reminder that forgiveness was the root from which all greatness grew. At the 200th anniversary of the foundation, a vast crowd filled the garden. Thousands of candles flickered under the twilight sky. A great-grandson named Michael Hale, a quiet man with thoughtful eyes, took the stage. His voice carried gently across the hushed crowd. 2 centuries ago, he began. My ancestors faced betrayal, greed, and loss. But instead of letting those things destroy them, they chose to transform them. They taught us that true power lies not in control, but in compassion, not in taking, but in giving. And tonight, we honor that choice. He paused, emotion catching in his throat. This garden, it isn't just our family's history. It's proof that love, once planted, never dies. It only multiplies. As he stepped back, thousands of lilies shimmered in synchronized light, part of a newly installed solar art project designed by one of the younger Hales. The glowing flowers spread in waves across the garden, symbolizing how one act of forgiveness can ripple through time, touching lives far beyond its origin. Later that night, Michael walked alone to the bench, the same one where Henry once sat, where David wept, where Emily whispered her promise, and where Anna left her locket. He sat down quietly, hands clasped, the hum of the crowd fading behind him. "Grandfather," he murmured, looking up at the stars. "You were right. Forgiveness really is the quietest form of revenge, and the loudest form of love." A soft wind rustled through the willow leaves, carrying with it the faintest scent of lilies and rain, the same fragrance that had lingered through every generation. Michael smiled, closing his eyes, and in the silence, if one listened closely, they could almost hear a chorus of voices, not ghosts, but echoes, whispering in harmony. Love endures, forgiveness heals, legacy lives. And so it was that the Margaret Hale Foundation, born from pain and loss, stood unbroken after 200 years, a monument to everything humanity could be when it chose love over vengeance. The story that began with a son's greed and a father's heartbreak ended not in bitterness, but in beauty, a beauty that outlasted time, reaching beyond graves, beyond memory, into eternity itself. Because some stories never end. They simply bloom again. As the last of the candles dimmed and the guests drifted away, the garden settled into silence once more. The moon hung low over the lilies, casting a silvery glow over every petal, every leaf, every stone that had borne witness to generations of the Hale family's triumphs and trials. The world outside the garden was louder now, faster, brighter, endlessly changing. But here, time moved gently. The air still held the same peace it had on that first night, when Henry Hale decided to let go of anger and choose love instead. Years passed, and technology advanced beyond what anyone could have imagined. The Margaret Hale Foundation adapted with it, expanding into a digital archive, the Hale Legacy Project, a vast interactive network where millions could share their own stories of forgiveness, resilience, and redemption. The Hale story became a seed that grew in countless hearts across the world. Michael's granddaughter, a historian named Clara Hale, became the guardian of that story. She preserved every letter, every journal, every photograph, tracing the lineage of forgiveness that stretched back to Henry and Margaret. One evening, as rain whispered against her study window, she opened an old leather-bound book, Henry's final journal, its pages yellowed and soft. She read his last entry aloud, her voice trembling. "If my family remembers nothing else of me, let them remember this, that love must be chosen over and over again. It's not the easy path, but it's the only one that leads home." Clara closed the journal and pressed her hand over her heart. Then she rose, wrapped herself in a shawl, and walked out into the night. The garden was slick with rain, each lily gleaming like glass under the moonlight. She approached the bench, still standing after all these centuries, and sat down. The same engraving caught the light. "Love is the only inheritance worth keeping." "I think I understand now," she whispered. "You weren't teaching us how to live forever. You were teaching us how to keep love alive long after we're gone." A soft gust brushed her cheek, warm despite the chill. The willow leaves swayed gently, and the lilies shimmered, their petals opening wider, almost as if answering her. Tears welled in Clara's eyes, but they weren't from sadness. They were from gratitude, gratitude for a family that had chosen love when hate would have been easier, for ancestors who had built something that couldn't be measured in dollars or deeds, but in the quiet peace that filled every life their story had touched. She leaned back and gazed at the stars. "It's all still here," she murmured, "every piece of it, every lesson." And in that moment, she realized something profound. Legacy wasn't about the past. It was about the future shaped by it. Every person who forgave because of the hails, every life rebuilt, every wound mended. That was the continuation of the story. The Hale family wasn't a lineage anymore. It was a living idea, one that would never die as long as someone, somewhere, chose forgiveness over revenge. As the night deepened, a single lily near the bench began to glow brighter than the rest. Golden, radiant, pulsing softly like a heartbeat. Clara smiled. "Good night, great-grandfather," she whispered. "Your story still blooms." And as dawn broke over the garden, spilling light across generations of love and loss, the Hale legacy continued, not just in memory, but in motion. Because love, once planted, never truly ends. Takes root in the souls of those who carry it forward. And there, it blooms, quietly, endlessly, forever. Decades turned into centuries, and though the world evolved in unimaginable ways, cities touching the clouds, machines learning to feel, and humanity reaching distant stars, the Hale Garden still stood in its quiet corner of Earth. Protected as a World Heritage Site, it became a sacred place not of religion, but of remembrance. A sanctuary where people from every walk of life came to breathe, reflect, and heal. The Margaret Hale Foundation had long since expanded beyond Earth. Its name now adorned relief stations on Mars, research labs orbiting Jupiter, and community sanctuaries across colonies. But no matter how far it reached, the heart of it all remained rooted in one truth that had outlasted time itself: forgiveness. A young archivist named Nora Hale, a descendant so far removed that Henry and Margaret were more myth than memory, worked as the caretaker of the legacy archives. Every message, story, and act of compassion inspired by the Hale family was stored in that vast digital library, glowing softly within a crystalline structure that floated above the old garden. One evening, while cataloging ancient video recordings, she found a forgotten file marked Henry_Hale_001. The video flickered to life, grainy, aged beyond repair, and there he was, Henry Hale, the man who began it all. His voice was soft, fragile with age, but his eyes still carried that quiet fire. "If you're watching this," he said, "then I'm long gone, and maybe the world's changed beyond what I could imagine. But if my words have reached you, that means the choice we made, to forgive, to love, still echoes. That's enough for me." He smiled faintly, "because one day you'll be the one to choose, between holding on to the pain that breaks you or letting go to build something greater. I hope you choose love." The video ended, but Nora sat frozen, tears slipping silently down her cheeks. She had grown up hearing the Hale legend, but in that moment it wasn't a story anymore. It was a living heartbeat, calling across centuries. She stood and walked to the observation window, looking down at the garden below. The lilies, descendants of the originals, still bloomed in their thousands, glowing faintly in the starlit air. Reaching into her pocket, she took out a small seed capsule, engineered to grow in any environment. She whispered softly, "Let's see if forgiveness can bloom somewhere new." And so, with a steady hand, she released it into the ether, a tiny glimmer drifting toward the red sands of Mars, where it would one day sprout the first legacy lily off Earth. Generations later, long after Nora's time, travelers landing on Mars would find a patch of golden lilies swaying in the thin air, their petals shimmering beneath an alien sun. A plaque beside them read, "The first flower planted on Mars was not for science, but for love, in memory of the Hale family, who proved that forgiveness is the only force that never dies." And so, from Earth to the stars, the Hale legacy lived on, not through monuments or money, but through the invisible threads of compassion that tied humanity together. It began with one man's heartbreak, one family's fall, and one choice to rise above. It became a movement that transcended borders, lifetimes, even planets. And in the endless expanse of the cosmos, where time itself will one day fade, the whisper will remain. Love is the only inheritance worth keeping. And the lilies, silent, steadfast, eternal, will keep blooming long after the stars themselves go dark. Millennia passed. The earth that once bore the Hale garden was no longer the same. Continents had shifted, oceans had receded, and humankind had scattered across the stars. Yet, even as worlds rose and fell, the Hale legacy endured. In the year 12,462 AE, thousands of years after Henry Hale first chose love over vengeance, an explorer named Soren Hale stood on the edge of what was once called New Terra. He was one of the last descendants who still bore the name, though by now, Hale was less a bloodline and more an idea, a symbol of hope carried through generations. The world beneath him was quiet. The old planet had become an emerald sphere reborn from ruin, its atmosphere slowly healing, its lands untouched by cities or war. Humanity had left to build their homes among the stars, but they still spoke of Earth as sacred ground, the birthplace of compassion. Soren was part of a historical expedition, tasked with rediscovering lost human sites. His ship landed near a signal deep within a dense forest, a faint energy pulse still transmitting after 10 millennia. Following it through the overgrowth, he found a structure made of pale stone, covered in moss and time. And there it was, the Hale Garden, overgrown, weathered, and silent, yet unmistakably alive. The willow tree, though ancient and twisted, still stood, and beneath its sweeping branches, the legacy lilies glowed faintly, their light pulsing in rhythm with the earth itself. Kneeling before the bench, Soren brushed away layers of soil until the words emerged, still clear, still true. Love is the only inheritance worth keeping. He exhaled, his visor fogging as emotion flooded through him. "You really meant it, didn't you?" he whispered. "You built something that even time couldn't erase." He reached into his pocket and drew out a small crystalline chip, the Hale Archive Core. Within it rested the collected wisdom, voices, and records of every generation that had carried the family's message. His mission had been to return it home. He placed the core on the bench, where the engraving caught the faint light. A hum filled the air, and the lilies around him began to glow brighter, not like plants, but like stars waking from sleep. The air shimmered with warmth. A holographic figure appeared before him, not perfect, flickering and translucent, but unmistakably human. It was Henry Hale. The ancient voice, soft yet steady, filled the space. "If you've come this far, it means our story reached you. You've carried it through generations, through worlds, through time itself. That's all I ever wanted. To prove that love could outlive us all." Soren's voice cracked. It did. Still alive even out there. Across every colony, every world. Your words built civilizations. Henry smiled gently. "Then you've done what I couldn't. You've made forgiveness infinite." The light dimmed, the hologram fading, but not before Henry's final words echoed through the air. "Remember, The inheritance isn't ours to keep. It's ours to pass on. As the vision faded, the lilies shone brighter still, until the entire garden seemed to glow like a beacon against the night. Soren stood there for a long time, tears blurring his vision, realizing that he wasn't just witnessing history, he was the history, the living continuation of a choice made thousands of years ago. He turned back toward his ship, his heart steady, his purpose renewed. Before leaving, he whispered one final promise into the quiet garden. "I'll pass it on." And when he departed, the earth, long silent, long forgotten, pulsed once more with gentle light. The lily's glow spread across the soil, carried by the wind, scattering seeds that shimmered as they took flight. Far above, as his ship ascended into the stars, Soren watched those tiny lights rise from the planet below. Millions of glowing lilies drifting into space, taking root on the winds of eternity. And thus, even as galaxies spun and stars burned out, the legacy of one family, born from heartbreak, strengthened by forgiveness, and immortalized through love, continued to bloom across the universe. Because no matter how far humanity travels, or how much time passes, some stories never die. They simply find new worlds to grow in.